I will never forget the night I heard the words no father should ever have to hear. "Dad, you're not welcome here." The sentence came out sharp from Daniel's mouth, my own son. No hesitation, no hidden affection between the lines, just coldness, as if he were informing me that I was nothing more than an intruder in his life. The room was full. Golden lights shimmered against crystal glasses, soft music played in the background, and everyone seemed perfectly at home in that scene of luxury. Everyone except me. I sat there in silence, my calloused hands resting on my knee, feeling the weight of every sideways glance thrown my way from the table. My daughter-in-law, Victoria, hid a cynical smile while whispering something into her friend's ear. The muffled laughter that followed didn't need translation. I knew I was the target. At that moment, my face burned. The air grew thin, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a sentence. And the most painful part, it came from the son I had raised with so much sacrifice, trading my nights of sleep, trading my own dreams for his. I searched his face for even the faintest trace of compassion. Nothing. Only indifference. Inside me, shame and anger collided, begging to break free, to make me rise from that chair and shout. But I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just sat still, because I learned long ago that silence can echo louder than any word. While the guests went on laughing and toasting, I felt my world collapsing in slow motion. Every clink of silverware against porcelain sounded like a hammer, nailing deeper the feeling that I was a stranger in the very house I once dreamed would also be mine. And it was in that moment that a certainty rose within me, silent, but firm as the iron I had molded so many times with my own hands. This would not end like that. Yes, he could tell me I wasn't welcome, but the one who decided who entered or who left, the legacy I had built, was still me. I took a deep breath. The bitter taste of rejection burned my throat, but behind the pain, a spark lit up. A silent promise, a turning point they would never see coming. And before I go further with this story, let me ask you something. Comment down below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because every time stories like mine are told, we prove together that no humiliation is big enough to stop someone from rising again. They tried to erase me at that table, but what they didn't know is that on that very night, I began writing the chapter of my victory. After those words, the walls seemed to close in around me. But to truly understand the weight of that moment, I need to take you back. I need to show you who the people in that room were and why each glance carried more than judgment. It carried the entire story of my life. The house we were in wasn't just a house. It was nearly a mansion. A white facade, massive columns that looked like something straight out of an old southern estate, and a garden so manicured it looked like a movie set. Everything flawless, everything gleaming. When I walked in that night, the smell of polished wood mixed with the expensive perfume Victoria sprayed around as if marking her territory. The sound of fine heels tapping against the marble floor contrasted with the creak of my worn-out boots. I knew I didn't belong in that scene. Every detail screamed it. Victoria was the invisible queen of the show. Long red dress, jewelry sparkling under the warm dining room lights, a rehearsed smile for every important guest. She moved like the hostess of the entire world. And at her side, Daniel, my son, crisp dress shirt, hair slicked back, perfectly knotted tie. The man I had built with my own calloused hands, working in the shop until my fingers cracked from the winter cold. Standing there, he looked perfect, but behind that image of success was something that cut me deeper than any physical wound, the complete erasure of who I had been for him. People came up to greet Daniel and Victoria, lawyers, businessmen, wealthy neighbors. I was introduced quickly, almost reluctantly. "This is my father, Edward." That was it. No stories, no pride, no memories, just a formality. And the worst part wasn't the words. It was the looks I saw when eyes ran over me, noticing the grease-stained hands that no soap could ever completely clean. I saw when they glanced away from my worn jacket, so different from the tailored coats parading through the room. It was as if I were some guest who had been invited by mistake. I remember one of Daniel's neighbors joking, "So your dad's really a carpenter? Interesting. Don't see much of that around here." and they laughed, not with admiration, with that disguised irony. Daniel didn't defend me, didn't say that same job had put food on his plate every single day of his childhood. He just gave a weak smile and changed the subject. That's when it hit me. It wasn't only about me not fitting in there. It was that they had decided long ago that I no longer belonged in the family narrative. I was the inconvenient shadow that needed to stay behind the curtain. The dining table reflected that truth. Crystal glasses, heavy silverware, plates that looked straight out of a magazine. And me, sitting at the corner, feeling like every bite they took was a silent reminder that I didn't belong in that performance. And the most painful part was the contrast. While they bragged about recent victories, I remembered the nights I carried lumber in the rain, the mornings I pushed carts full of heavy tools so Daniel could stay in school. Maybe it sounds like a father's pride, but it's the truth. None of what he had would exist without what I built first. Every brick of that mansion reminded me of another house, the small one I had raised years ago, where Daniel took his first steps. A simple home, but one built with sweat and love. And yet, in that room, it was as if it had never existed. Victoria, on the other hand, made sure to reinforce that distance. Every time she spoke to me, it was with that sweet, fake tone, dripping with superiority. "Mr. Harris, are you comfortable? I hope the food is to your taste. It's a little different from what you're probably used to." I only nodded. But inside, every word was a knife. The grandchildren were there too. Emily, the youngest, still ran to hug me. Her eyes carried that innocence that hadn't yet learned the cruelty of adult words. But the oldest, already influenced, greeted me with coldness. He called me the different grandpa. Different. That word echoed like a cruel reminder. I watched it all in silence, but with every passing second, I felt like I was sinking deeper into a pit of invisibility. And still, inside me, something pulsed. A memory that kept me standing. I knew who I was. They could try to erase me. They could try to rewrite my story, but they could never take away what I had built with my own hands. That night, in the middle of forced laughter and clinking glasses, I realized this wasn't just a dinner. It was a stage. And I hadn't been placed there as part of the family, but as a background extra. The extra who, soon enough, would rewrite the entire script. Sometimes I catch myself wondering, at what point did my own son decide to forget who I was? Because the truth is, I wasn't born invisible. I come from a generation of men who rose before the sun with hands already tired before the day had even begun. My workshop stood at the end of the main street in Bloomington, a small town in Indiana where everybody knew everybody. It was a simple building filled with a sharp smell of cut wood, the hum of the electric saw, and the fine dust that settled in the corners. I'm proud to say that for 40 years, not a single house in that county went up without my hands on it in some way. Doors, windows, staircases, even the church pews were my work. I wasn't rich. I didn't have a degree, but I had something most men didn't, the quiet respect that only comes from knowing how to do the work. And with that respect, I raised Daniel. I remember his worn-out school uniform, the nights I spent hours fixing a broken lamp so he could study without straining his eyes. There were days when I skipped dinner so he could have milk in the fridge for breakfast. Daniel was always bright, I won't deny it. While I dealt with lumber and hammers, he dealt with numbers and books. And I never wanted him to repeat my life of calluses and aching shoulders. So when he told me he wanted to be a lawyer, I just smiled and said, "If that's what you want, son, I'll help you get there." The problem was helping wasn't simple. Tuition was expensive. Books cost almost as much as my weekly wages. To pay for it, I worked double. I took on the jobs nobody wanted: roofing in the dead of winter, repairs in abandoned houses, custom furniture that ate up entire nights. One summer, I slept in my workshop so often that neighbors joked I should start paying rent to myself. But every time I saw Daniel moving forward, every time I opened a letter from his college with his name on it, I felt it was worth it. I wasn't just building furniture. I was building a future, and I did build it. Daniel graduated with honors, passed the bar, and was hired by a big firm. At his graduation ceremony, I remember sitting in the last row, wearing my best suit, even though it still looked worn compared to all the designer clothes around me. When they called his name, I clapped until my hands hurt. I looked around. Some parents stood to applaud their kids. I stood too, even if I was the only one. And in that moment, I thought, I did it. My son has wings. But time showed me that the higher he rose, the farther he drifted from the man who built the foundation. Suddenly, I was no longer the father who sacrificed everything for him. I was just the simple man who spoke the wrong way, who didn't know the names of wines, who didn't understand the codes of his new world. And the worst part? He never told me directly. He just slowly erased me. Old photos disappeared from his walls. The stories he once told proudly about how I built his childhood home with my own hands turned into something he avoided out of embarrassment. My dad has always been practical, he would say, trying to minimize it. Practical. That word weighed on me like a disguised insult. I wasn't just practical. I was essential. Victoria, of course, made sure to speed that process up. To her, I was nothing more than an inconvenient reminder, a piece that didn't fit into the polished image she wanted to show the world. And Daniel accepted it in silence. The irony of life is cruel. I built doors for so many people, yet my own son chose to shut his on me. And there, at that dinner table, while everyone toasted and laughed, I realized that no one remembered who I had been. No one except Aimee. But that was about to change, because it's one thing to try to erase the past. It's another thing entirely to face the living proof it left behind, and I had kept all of it. Thanksgiving dinner was nearly over when the first dagger was thrown. I was quiet, watching the grandkids play near the fireplace, when I heard Victoria's voice rise sharp as a knife coated in sugar. "Edward, I hope you're enjoying yourself," she said, with the fakest smile I've ever seen. We made a point of choosing sophisticated dishes, a little different from what you're probably used to. Some guests chuckled discreetly. Others hid behind their wine glasses to avoid the scene. My face burned. I felt every eye turn to me, as if testing whether I even knew how to hold a silver fork. I tried to breathe, but inside, humiliation was eating me alive. Daniel stood beside her. All it would have taken was a word from him, a gesture of defense, a reminder of who I had been to him. But he just adjusted his tie, forced a weak smile, and looked away. That silence from him hurt worse than her comment. I gripped my fork so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell her that maybe my meals were simple, but they had kept her husband alive when he was just a broke student with no future guaranteed. But I said nothing. I swallowed it down. Dinner went on, but inside me, everything had shifted. Every laugh, every toast felt like a reminder that I was a stranger in that house. After dessert, Daniel came over. "Dad, let's take a walk," he said, in that rehearsed courtroom tone of his. We stepped out into the garden. The cold night air bit at my skin, the trees strung with Christmas lights blinking like silent witnesses to what was about to happen. I still carried a flicker of hope that maybe he would apologize, or at least comfort me after his wife's cruelty. But what came out of his mouth was a verdict. "Dad," he paused as if searching for diplomatic words. "Maybe it's better if you don't come to dinners like this anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He took a breath, straightened his jacket, and said flatly, "You don't fit in here." Don't fit in. Those words crashed through me like thunder. I felt my chest tighten, my eyes sting. I looked at him, searching for a hint of regret, but there was nothing, just coldness. It was as if I were an old piece of furniture, something that no longer matched the new decor. My heart pounded. Memories flooded. Back every sleepless night, every dollar saved, every dream postponed so he could have all the things that now made him look down on me. "So that's it?" I whispered. "After everything I did for you, I'm not good enough anymore?" He didn't answer. He just turned his eyes away, like he didn't want to stain his suit with the dust of my pain. And his silence was the confirmation. I stood there in the November cold, feeling as if the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I, the man who had raised walls with his own hands, suddenly had nothing to lean on. For a few seconds, I thought about shouting, demanding respect. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. His decision was already made. And in that moment, Somewhere between shame and anger, a certainty was born inside me. If I was no longer welcome in his world, then he would no longer be welcome in mine. The cold cut into my skin, but inside me something else burned. It wasn't sadness. It was the beginning of something different, something I couldn't yet name, but that would soon become the turning point of my life. I went back inside, trying to hide my flushed face. The guests kept drinking, laughing, oblivious to what had just happened. Victoria smiled at everyone. Daniel chatted as if nothing had been said, but I knew. That night, a line had been drawn. I was no longer just the father they could silently humiliate. I had become the man who sooner or later would return every word. After that night in the garden, nothing was the same. I went home with that phrase echoing in my head, "You don't fit in here," and it never came alone. It always carried Victoria's muffled laugh, the sideways looks of the guests, and Daniel's cold silence. I knew that dinner had not just been a dinner. It was a warning that from then on, my presence would be treated as a burden. And that's exactly what happened. The following week was Emily's birthday, my youngest granddaughter. I had never missed one. She was the one who always ran to me, hugged my legs, and told me how much she missed me. But this time, the invitation never came. I only found out because a neighbor mentioned it excitedly. "I heard your son threw a beautiful party for the little one. Must have been wonderful." My heart sank. I hadn't been invited. I called Daniel, trying to mask the pain with forced calm. "Son, I heard about Emily's party." On the other end, an awkward silence. "Ah, Dad, it all came together at the last minute. I didn't want to bother you." Bother me? I, the grandfather, had become a bother. That was the first stab, but not the last. Not long after, I passed by the old family home, the one I had built myself, brick by brick, with my own hands. The windows were different, the paint was fresh. A sold sign swayed on the lawn. My heart froze. Daniel had sold the house without even telling me. I called him, outraged. "Why didn't you say anything? That house was part of our history." His reply came dry, almost dismissive. "Dad, it was just an old house. We needed something more modern. Just an old house." For him, maybe. For me, it was the place where I buried years of my life, where I watched my children grow, where I buried my dreams just to feed their realities, and the small cuts didn't stop there. When we did gather again, Victoria always made sure to remind me of my place. One Christmas, she placed a cheap bottle of wine in front of me and said with that mocking tone, "I figured this once. More your style, Edward." The muffled laughs around the table struck like hammers. Even my oldest grandson began repeating the poison that dripped from his mother's mouth. One day, he looked me up and down and said, shamelessly, "Mom says you look like a weird old man." I forced a smile to keep from breaking, but inside I felt like someone had ripped a piece out of me. These little rejections piled up like stones on my chest. They weren't explosions. They were drops. Drops that, day by day, drowned me in silence. People in town began to notice. Some neighbors asked why they no longer saw me at Daniel's events. I just lowered my head and muttered excuses. "I've been tired lately, prefer staying home." But the truth was, I wasn't invited anymore. I was no longer part of the family I had built with so much sacrifice. With each injustice, each silence, something inside me shifted. At first, it was pain. Then, it turned into anger. And finally, it began to transform into determination. Because the more they tried to diminish me, the more I remembered everything I had done. And the more they treated me like a burden, the more I held on to the certainty that it wasn't me who should feel ashamed. I saw Victoria's arrogance, Daniel's quiet contempt, the indifference of their friends. But I also saw something they couldn't, my story. And it was still alive, still beating, just waiting for the right moment to roar. I didn't know when or how, but one thing was certain. The man they tried to bury in silence still had enough strength left to surprise them. People think revenge begins with shouting, with explosions of rage, but mine began in silence. It was there, in the back of my old workshop, where the smell of wood still mixed with the rust of my tools, that I planted the seed of my turning point. Every night I sat alone, staring at that toolbox that had been with me since I was young. Every scratch on its lid carried a story. It was with that box that I built the family home, the beds where my children slept, the tables where we broke bread countless times. Now, that box would be more than a memory. It would guard my decision. I pulled out the documents I had kept over the years, deeds to land, the title to the farm I'd inherited from my father, the deed to the little house by the lake, and bank accounts I had built quietly, decades of savings from hard labor. People thought I was just an old carpenter with nothing. Little did they know that, even earning modestly, I had learned to save. While Victoria spent on dresses and dinners, I had slowly built a fortune no one suspected existed. I sat at the table, spread the papers out, and stared at them for a long time. It wasn't just money. It was the concrete proof of my life. Sweat turned into something real, and it was there that I made the decision. Daniel and Victoria would inherit nothing. I would change my will, not out of anger, though it burned inside me, but out of justice. If I wasn't welcome in their house, they wouldn't be welcome in the legacy I had built. I began planning in silence. I found a lawyer I trusted, a simple man like me who had known my story since we were young. "Edward, are you sure about this?" he asked, looking me in the eyes. "Absolutely," I said. "I won't let them spit on the plate I served with my own hands." Each signature I put on that new document lifted a weight from my shoulders. It felt like I was rebuilding myself, brick by brick, from the ruins they tried to bury me in. I also decided to leave a meaningful part of my estate to institutions that had always respected me. The school where Daniel studied, the church that never closed its doors to me, the small community library, and of course, I couldn't forget Emily, my youngest granddaughter, the only one who still ran to me, eyes shining as if I were a real hero. She would receive something special, something kept with care, so she would never forget who I was. I did all of this in silence. Whenever I saw Daniel or Victoria, I kept a calm face. They thought they were winning, that they were erasing me little by little. What they didn't know was that, while they underestimated me, I was already writing the final chapter of that story. And there was something liberating about keeping that secret. It was like carrying a hidden flame in my pocket, small, invisible, but capable of setting an entire room on fire at the right moment. I knew that moment would come, and I knew it wouldn't happen at just any meeting. It would be on a symbolic night, in front of everyone, when they least expected it. Every gesture they made against me only confirmed I was on the right path. Every look of contempt from Victoria, every complicit silence from Daniel, every sharp word that slipped into family conversations was another brick in the wall that separated me from them. But it was also another nail in the structure of my decision. And while they convinced themselves they had diminished me, I was walking, step by step, toward the day I would show them who was truly in control. Because life can take many things from you, but dignity, when you decide to reclaim it, becomes heavier than any inheritance, and I was ready to prove it. Christmas came as always, streets glittering with lights, soft carols floating from neighbors' homes, children running with colorful scarves, but inside me, nothing sparkled. I already knew what awaited me at Daniel's mansion. More cutting looks, more fake smiles, more attempts to grind me into dust. Still, I went. Not for myself, but for Emily, my youngest granddaughter, who had asked me with those innocent eyes untouched by the cruelty of the world, "Grandpa, you'll come for Christmas, right?" And I didn't have the heart to disappoint her. When I arrived, the mansion looked like it had stepped out of a Christmas card. A massive tree stood in the living room, covered in gold and silver ornaments. The smell of roast turkey filled the air. Crystal glasses clinked to the rhythm of cheerful conversations. I walked in slowly, feeling like every step echoed louder than it should. Victoria was the first to notice me, stunning as always in a dark green dress shimmering under the tree lights. "Oh, you really did come," she said, pretending to be surprised. "I thought you wouldn't show up." "Emily invited me," I replied simply. She didn't answer, just gave a cold smile and went back to her guests. Daniel greeted me with a quick handshake, without even looking me in the eye. "Dad." Then he turned away to toast with some of his colleagues. I sat in a corner watching. The guests talked about trips to Europe, about investments, about promotions. My name wasn't mentioned except in occasional comments that sounded more like an obligation than affection. It was during dinner that the humiliation came. When it was time for the wine, Victoria held up 2 bottles, one expensive, a French vintage, the other cheap with a faded label. With a smile, she filled Daniel's glass with the French wine, and when she reached me, she poured the cheap one. I figured this one was more your taste, Edward. Her voice was sweet, but dripping with venom. Some laughed, others looked away. My heart raced. I looked at Daniel. All it would have taken was a word from him. But he lowered his eyes, embarrassed not for me, but for the fact that I was even there. That was when I knew the time had come. I stood up slowly. I felt every eye following me, curious, some already preparing to laugh at old Edward's next blunder. I walked over to the Christmas tree. Under it, among the glittering boughs and colorful boxes, was my old toolbox. I had placed it there earlier without anyone noticing. I picked it up carefully, like it was a treasure. "What's that?" someone asked, chuckling. I set the box on the table. Silence fell across the room. I opened it slowly, revealing the papers, the deeds, the revised will. The glow of the ornaments reflected off the documents like they were jewels. I looked at Daniel. He seemed confused, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. Victoria, on the other hand, had lost her smile. "You've always wanted to remind me that I don't belong here," I began, my voice firm, unwavering. "That I'm just a simple man, with no place in this world of luxury." I paused. No one moved. "Well then, tonight I came to remind you of something. Everything I own, every dollar, every piece of land, I built with these hands." I held up my scarred, calloused hands marked by decades of labor. Some guests lowered their eyes, ashamed. "And since I'm not welcome in my son's house, then he and his wife are no longer welcome in my inheritance." The phrase fell like a bomb. The silence was so heavy you could hear the crackle of the fireplace. Daniel stood, nervous. "Dad, what are you doing?" "I'm just giving you the same gift you gave me. Exclusion," I answered. Victoria tried to laugh, but her voice cracked. "This is absurd. Absurd as forgetting where you came from." My reply was short, but sharp. I looked around. Some relatives stared at me wide-eyed, others nodded in quiet approval. It was as if, for an instant, everyone had seen the naked truth. I was not the one who should feel ashamed. I closed the box and held it firmly. From this day forward, my legacy doesn't belong to those who rejected me, but to those who still understand the value of respect. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one. Lowering my head, they were. The room felt frozen. The lights of the tree blinked slowly, reflecting off the stunned faces of the guests. The clinking of glasses stopped. The conversations vanished. All that remained was the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own heart beating steady in my chest. I stayed standing, the toolbox open on the table. The papers lay there in plain sight, silent witnesses to my entire life. Daniel's eyes shook. He didn't know whether to confront me or stay quiet. Victoria, on the other hand, tried to keep her composure, but the color had drained from her face. She clutched her wine glass so tightly it looked like it might shatter. That was when I spoke the final line. I didn't need to shout. My voice came out low but unshakable. "If I'm not welcome in your house, then you're not welcome in my inheritance." The words sliced through the air like a blade. For a moment, I saw Daniel swallow hard, unable to respond. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked at me with respect. It was as if the entire room understood, all at once, that the power had changed hands. Victoria tried to regain control. "This is madness, Edward. You can't just—" I cut her off without hesitation. "I can, because everything here was built by me, and no one has the right to erase the value of my name." The silence returned, heavier than before. I looked at Emily, sitting quietly in the corner. Her wide eyes weren't filled with fear, but with admiration. And in that instant, I realized my fight had already been worth it. The words kept echoing inside me. They weren't just a reply to them. They were the cry of every time I had been humiliated in silence, of every night I swallowed pain without complaint. They were the closing line of a story they thought they could write without me. And for the first time in many years, I felt dignity return to the space they had tried to steal. The room no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. After I spoke, the room was never the same again. The Christmas lights seemed dimmer. The golden ornaments no longer carried the same grandeur. It was as if all the ostentation had transformed into a backdrop of collective shame. Daniel stood frozen, like a cracked statue. The guests looked at him, waiting for a reaction, but what they saw was a lost man unable to uphold his own silence. That confident lawyer, who had spoken so many times before judges and juries, could not find words before his own father. Victoria, on the other hand, tried to recover her composure. "Edward, this is a ridiculous performance," she said, her voice trembling. "No one will believe you actually did this." I simply lifted the box and tapped lightly on the papers. "You don't need to believe me. Everything is legally registered." A murmur swept through the room. Some guests, who had once laughed at my calloused hands, now looked at me with genuine respect. Others averted their eyes, ashamed realizing they had cheered for the wrong side of the story. And in that instant, I noticed something important. It wasn't me who left that room diminished. It was them. Daniel and Victoria, who always paraded themselves as the perfect couple, now stood exposed. Not just in front of me, but in front of everyone. The next day, word spread through the neighborhood. "Did you hear what happened at the Harris Christmas dinner?" They say old Edward slammed the inheritance door right in his son's face. Some told it with surprise, others with admiration. And for the first time in a long while, my name was spoken again with respect. Daniel tried to reach out to me a few days later. He came to my house unannounced, knocking on the door, hesitant. When I opened it, his eyes were different, no arrogance left, only desperation. "Dad, we need to talk." I shook my head. "You already said everything you needed to say, Daniel, and so did I." I closed the door slowly, leaving him outside just as he had done to me so many times, only this time in silence. Victoria didn't bother to come, but I heard she cried out of rage when she found out she wouldn't inherit a thing. For her, who measured everything in money and status, my decision was a wound that would never heal. I, on the other hand, felt something I hadn't felt in years: lightness. I donated part of my estate to the school that welcomed me when I had nothing but tools and willingness. I helped the community library expand its reading rooms. I gave the church enough to finally repair the roof that always leaked in the winter. And I made sure Emily, my granddaughter, received something special, not just money, but a piece of the memory of the grandfather she would never forget. The consequences were clear. Daniel lost not only the inheritance, but also the respect of the community that once applauded him. At social gatherings, he was no longer seen as the brilliant attorney, but as the man who rejected his own father and was rejected in return. Victoria, no matter how hard she tried to hide it, carried humiliation in her eyes. And me? I regained what they had tried to strip away: dignity. I learned that sometimes the greatest victory doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from waiting for the right moment to speak the truth. The Christmas room was left behind, but the lesson stayed. Those who try to erase their own roots eventually discover it is the root that holds up the tree. And that frozen winter night, it was the old carpenter, the one they tried to bury in silence, who showed he still knew how to raise walls that would stand. And those walls weren't made of wood or stone. They were made of respect. Life has a strange way of putting things back in place. That Christmas night, when I closed the toolbox in front of everyone, I felt something else close inside me. It wasn't just the door to the inheritance. It was the door to years of silence, years of swallowing humiliation, years of accepting less than I deserved. In the days that followed, I realized the weight on my shoulders was gone. I walked through the streets of Bloomington no longer ashamed to lower my head. On the contrary, I looked people in the eye. Some came to shake my hand, others patted my shoulder and said, "Edward, what you did was brave." And I smiled, not because I sought recognition, but because I understood that my act had become something greater, a reminder that dignity is not up for negotiation. My simple home, with its old wooden walls and the smell of coffee in the morning, had never felt so comfortable. While Daniel's world revolved around appearances, mine began to revolve around something truer: the freedom of owing nothing to anyone. Sometimes I sat on the porch with Emily, who visited me whenever she could. She ran through the yard, laughed out loud, then sat beside me with a cup of hot chocolate. "Grandpa, Why did you give me the toolbox?" she asked one day, her innocent eyes searching mine. I took a deep breath, looked at the horizon, and said, "Because that box carries the story of our family, and whoever respects the story deserves to keep writing it." She smiled, as if she understood more than she let on. And in that moment, I realized that all the effort, all the pain, all the confrontation had been worth it. Daniel was never the same after that night, not because he lost money, but because he lost something far more valuable: trust. I don't know if deep down he'll ever understand. Maybe life will show him, maybe not, but it's no longer my burden to carry. Victoria avoided even meeting my eyes. The arrogance that once carried her seemed shattered, and in a way, I almost pitied her, because those who measure everything by status never learn the value of what truly matters. What remained with me was one certainty: I wasn't alone. Every father, every mother, every grandparent who has ever been treated as invisible carries the same flame inside. The difference is, few ever get the chance to light it in front of everyone. I did, and I didn't waste it. Today, when I look back, I don't feel resentment. I feel gratitude, because if not for their rejection, maybe I never would have rediscovered the strength that still lived inside me. The strength to say enough. The strength to prove that no cruel phrase can erase a lifetime of work and love. And if I could sum it all up in one single lesson, it would be this: those who shut the door on their own blood will eventually discover that true power lies with the one holding the keys, not just to the inheritance, but to dignity. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever lived something similar? Have you ever been treated as if you had no value in your own family? Leave a comment down below. Your voice deserves to be heard. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every time we share stories like this, we prove together that no humiliation is ever big enough to stop a comeback, and that respect is never begged for. It's earned.